This is an experience my mom and dad had that happened in December of 2017. They were coming back home from eating out and pulled into their driveway and parked. The area where they live is moderately wooded and on a large plot of land, about 20 acres. They got out of their car and started to walk up to the door when they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from only about 10 feet away. Not only was the scream terrifying, but it was extremely loud. My dad's a state trooper, and he served in the Marine Corps, so not much will actually scare him. He's the kind of guy to watch a horror movie at 3 o'clock in the morning with all the lights off and the curtains open. However, that night, he said he was genuinely terrified. They snapped out of their trance and ran inside, and he came back out with his gun and got in his patrol car, started checking out the area. He shined his spotlight down into the pasture and around the property, but couldn't find anything. The fact that he did this is alarming because he would never pull a gun out if he was joking. I've only seen him actually pull a gun out 2 other times in my life, and it was never a good experience. Only about a week after I came back from college for winter break, I sat on the front porch and was drinking coffee. It was pretty cold out. I was reading a book when I heard something eerie coming from the pasture to the east of my house. My house faces south. It sounded like creaking, but there was no wind blowing, and I know that the area has no hanging branches or anything for that matter that would have justified that sound. Even though it creeped me out, I refused to think anything of it and brush it off as strange but explainable. Thoroughly chilled, no pun intended, I stopped reading my book because of bad lighting from the Christmas lights and went inside. After a while, I realized I had forgotten my book outside and went out to grab it. This time, I heard a low, poor howl. The only canine creatures that live around their place are coyotes, and when you hear them, it's a mixture of yips and short, pitchy howls. Hearing it and having my fears proved that it was definitely something otherworldly, I grabbed my book and ran inside. About 25 minutes later, my brother comes home from a friend's house. He walks in and doesn't say anything other than, "Hey." I tell him what I experienced, and to my surprise, he said he heard the same thing just a couple of minutes earlier when he was walking inside. The sound had moved from its previous location southwest of my position and was now in the northwest corner of the property. He said the sound was a long, deep, but poor or weak kind of growl like the one that I had heard. My brother seemed more spooked with his encounter than I did with mine. He said that the duration was just so long and that it sounded fake, almost like a poor imitation. After that, there weren't any more sightings the entire time I was home. It's since been ruled as a deer, since we do have a lot of them, and they make some strange noises, but after reading through Reddit, I feel like we might have had a skinwalker issue or something of the sort. We do live near a spot where the Native Americans hold powers, and there's a house in our neighborhood that is allegedly built on Native American burial grounds, so I wouldn't be surprised if this was the case. I have other experiences with some strange sounds and being whistled at in the dark, but no sightings as of yet. I live in rural Idaho, about 6 miles from a reservation. Growing up, we heard all sorts of stories and legends surrounding the res. I have to admit, I was a bit of a skeptic when it came to things that we heard. My best friend and I have always been drawn to the paranormal. When we were about 16 or 17, we decided that we'd go for drives on the RES at night. The area we live in has a very tight-knit community, and our little town has just over 10,000 people. We basically have no crime, and everyone feels pretty safe, so driving around at night is no big deal. We went on our night drives fairly often, with no experiences to note. One day, we heard a story from someone at school about an abandoned schoolhouse on the other side of the reservation. Just past the schoolhouse, there was supposed to be a small bridge that went over a large farming canal. The story was, if you drove to the bridge and turned your car off, you could hear water babies. If you don't know what they are, There are many different stories and legends stemming from Native American culture about them, so go look them up. Anyway, we decided that that was going to be our next driving destination. Neither of us had ever heard a water baby cry, so we were interested. That night after dark, we jumped in my car and started driving out there. The closer we got to the schoolhouse, the more uneasy I began to feel. We drove past the buildings that were supposedly the schoolhouse and stopped on the bridge. I cut the lights and killed the engine. Silence. There was no sound but the rushing water below the bridge. We sat there for what felt like forever. In reality, it was probably only 4 or 5 minutes. We heard nothing but the water. We started joking about the story being fake and decided that it was a bust and we should just go home. The keys were still in the ignition, so I simply tried to start the car. Nothing. The dash lights lit up, but it just wouldn't turn over. I'd never had any problems with that car before. I tried a couple more times while talking with a friend, not wanting to freak her out. About the 3rd or 4th time, I turned to her and said, "Listen, I don't want to freak you out or anything, but my car won't start." Her eyes grew wide and she responded with, "You're fucking with me, right?" I wish I had been. We sat there for a minute, just staring at each other, not knowing what to do. If we called my mom, there would definitely be some ass chewing for being out on the rest so late at night. So we decided to call one of our friends that had a truck. If the battery was dead, he could just give us a jump. If not, he could tow us back to town. So we called and waited, sitting in the middle of this bridge in my dead car. Frustrated from the lack of experience and the car troubles, we just wanted to go home. And that's when I saw it. It's a well-known fact that the reservation has packs of wild dogs that roam around killing livestock, and there have been a few instances of them attacking kids and putting them in the hospital. But this was no dog. I've seen coyotes and wolves, and there was no way in hell that this thing was either of those either. It was skeletal, like a malnutrition to animal, and was walking on all fours. Slow and low to the ground, it was walking along the canal toward the bridge. I smacked my friend, making her turn to look at what I was staring at. We both stared in disbelief at this creature slowly coming toward us. Instinctively, I honked the horn. At least that still worked. And that's when things got really weird. This thing stood up on 2 legs, arms limited side. I legit screamed. I had never seen anything like this in my entire life. The best way I can think of to describe it is that it looked Professor Lupin's werewolf form in Harry Potter, the Prisoner of Azkaban movie. It was freaking massive. It stood between 8 and 9 feet tall, and it was staring right at us. It took a couple steps forward. My friend and I were frozen. We were trapped in a car that wouldn't start. As it slowly started walking toward us, headlights appeared in the distance. As the lights came closer, the creature dropped back to all fours and took off for the hills where I assume it came from. Our friend pulled up to help us, and both my creeped-out friend and I kept quiet about what we had just witnessed. He walked up to the car, and I rolled my window down. He suggested we push the car off the bridge to the side of the road and pop the hood, so I threw it into neutral and got it off the side of the road. My friend asked me to pop the hood and try to start the car, so I did. The damn thing started right up. I don't know what caused it to not start before, but that night I had an experience I will never forget. I don't go out on the ries anymore at night. I'd really rather not see whatever that was again. It seemed like any other day. But my driver's license was going to expire in about a week, so I dreaded the thought of going to the DMV, but I had an idea. Everyone always goes on the weekends or on Monday. Well, what if I played the system and tried the middle of the week to get around it all? I get stressed out in public areas around lots of strangers and couldn't find any friends who would willingly go with me. I resigned myself to go alone and go after lunch sometime. Parking my car, I noticed that there were only 3 other cars there. Perfect, no lying to deal with. I also noticed that this is not exactly a public place. It's sort of near some woods. Nothing out in the wilderness, but definitely near the outskirts of town. Stepping inside, I see that there are a few people here and only one worker in today. My plan had not accounted for this. As you would expect, things went very slowly. Soon it was just one more person in front of me, and counting the tiles on the roof again when I hear the door open. I didn't think to look that way, but suddenly the smell hit me. It was like old milk or spoiled food. Coughing. I turned to see two strange people walk in. One had slightly greasy hair, but that was as dirty as they looked. They seemed sort of spaced out, not all there, and they were dressed in common enough clothes. Now I know the running joke about smelly people at the DMV, so that's how I just tossed it off. However, when they moved behind me in line, it was pretty bad. The office didn't smell great to begin with, but it was awful now, as if time was going slow enough, without something else, to make me more conscious of being there. These two guys had weird behavior, like they were drunk or on drugs or something. So again, I just figured the usual at the DMV. But when they talked to each other, they had holes in what they were saying. Like, for example, if one of them noticed a poster, they would look at it and say, "Do you?" and gesture at the poster. "Is there?" But they did not have accents, so clearly it wasn't a language barrier. And if it was, why use the language you don't know? So now I'm really creeped out as the person is posing for the camera in front of me. I'm praying they hurry and get out so I can finish here. I could not help but keep peeking at them when I thought they weren't looking. I mess up, and the bald one is looking in my direction when I look over at him. Of course, I averted my gaze like I was looking to the door or something. Every so often, I'm looking back, and he's staring at me, and he's doing this weird face, like he was smiling but forgot to lift the edges of his mouth into a smile. So he wasn't baring his teeth, but it wasn't comforting. The more I noticed him staring at me, the more I felt his gaze. I hear one of them say, "Who is there?" Odd thing to say. I look back and see both of them staring at me fixedly. I'm at the front of the line now, but with two creepy people looking at me as I'm trying to take care of paperwork. It was a little bit difficult. I had almost gotten used to the smell by now. The lady's given me a weird look as I am super nervous and sweating. She asks me if I'm okay. What can I say? Two people who smell like death are staring at me in line. I go and get to the booth and take a picture. And they're making creepy chittering noises that sound something like laughing as they keep staring at me. The picture has me sort of looking off to the side of them, and she informs me that I must be facing the camera. And my eyes must be looking at it. It's the only way they can confirm my eye color. It's not a good picture, but I grab it. I pay, and I'm busting through the door to get to my car. As I'm leaving, I notice the bald one at the door, staring at me. I get out of there fast and drown my fear and some heavy gaming and comfort food that night, until I'm so tired that I pass out. So in the Philippines, there are two bits of modern folklore that resonate with descriptions of skinwalkers in the United States: wolf-bird-like creatures who travel by night, and bulletproof people said to live in the mountains. I lived in Cebu for a good couple of years with cousins in a relatively large northern city on some farmland owned by my late grandfather, and I heard these stories from my aunt and uncle on either side of the family. Someday during the first week I was there, karaoke had finished playing by around 2 a.m., and I was laying in bed. I had a little shack surrounded by brush and large trees. With most neighbors being relatives, things were fairly quiet. I was made aware of something large moving in the grass outside. At first I thought it was a person, and I started getting anxious when it moved so close to my window. But it stopped, momentarily maybe 15 feet from me, and I could hear heavy breathing like a lion. Then it let out a long and loud howl, exactly like a wild wolf, and continued walking through the property. I was basically paralyzed at that point and tried to ignore it, but it immediately made no sense to me at all. I mean, what the hell is a wolf doing on an island that has no wolves? And why does this thing sound like it's 6 feet tall? And if there was a giant animal, just casually walking around, why was it so close to the busiest road in Cebu and the most populated city for miles? I couldn't wrap my head around the whole experience. That was 4 years ago. I only now discovered skinwalker tales here in the US. And while the videos I've watched don't reproduce the sound I heard, some details are similar, namely that they only appear at night, are bulletproof shapeshifters, and have a wolf-like appearance. The videos here sound more like coyotes howling, but the breathing is similar. I don't know what to make of my experience, but I might have seen a skinwalker. This happened to my mother, actually, and she told me about it later, the night that it occurred. After we moved to the middle of nowhere about a year and a half ago, I began researching the paranormal as a sort of hobby. My family is an hour away from any nearby town and surrounded by sparse woods filled with dark pine and gnarled old oak trees that give me the creeps. I think this fueled my research into the paranormal, as it's such an unnerving setting right outside the window. I ended up stumbling across skinwalkers one day during my research and was instantly drawn to them. I'm not sure why. Maybe the fact that it was a tangible creature. I don't know. Anyway, about a month into my odd obsession, I left at about 5 o'clock in the morning with my brother for the nearest town an hour away to stay with our grandparents for the night. That night, my mother called to tell me about an odd encounter she'd had with a deer about a half hour after my brother and I had left. She was home alone and had just gotten out of the shower. The sun was just starting to come up, so it was relatively dark outside, and she heard 2 short, sharp knocks on the window. The 2 family dogs started going absolutely nuts in the living room. She walked out into the living room and saw a stag standing on its hind legs, peering into the living room window. The family dogs, otherwise good-natured and familiar with deer at this point, were snarling, their hackles raised, and she said she could see the whites of their eyes. When it turned and saw my mom standing there, she said it blew air out of its nose, fogging up the window. That's how close it was. Then it dropped down onto all fours again before slowly wandering off down the driveway. My mom thought she'd had a rare encounter with a deer and was excited to tell me about it, since we're both animal lovers, but it made my blood run ice cold and scared the shit out of me. Personally, it feels way too well-timed to be a coincidence. I've stopped my research, all of it actually, into anything paranormal, and we haven't had anything similar happen since. This story recollects what happened during the Navajo Nation fair season of 2016. My roommate and her boyfriend decided to head back to the reservation to take part in the festivities, a rodeo parade, and a carnival. My roommate was the offspring of divorced parents and spent her teenage years half on the reservation in Window Rock, Arizona with her mother and half with her father in Phoenix. She was raised as a devout Catholic, even attending Catholic school. Nothing paranormal had ever occurred to her in her lifetime up until this point. Her boyfriend was an urban Navajo who was a Christian, having been born and raised off the reservation in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm declaring their religious ideologies and affiliations because neither of them believed in Navajo traditionalism or ghost stories. Late one evening, after both of them got off work, they decided to head out to make the most of the 3-day fair weekend. My roommate had made prior accommodations with a good friend from high school. When my roommate was a young adult, her mother decided to move away from the reservation. If her mother still lived in Window Rock, she would have simply stayed there. The accommodations were as follows. Her good friend opted to stay at a close relative's and offered her 2-bedroom, 2-bath manufactured home with their disposal. The trailer was located off the road between St. Michael's and the first 4-way intersection. The first intersection pass, KTNN, when you are headed towards Window Rock from the summit, that's where she was, many of you might call it, the back road to St. Michael's. the old original township of St. Michael's, that is. As you can imagine, they arrived at their Navajo fair, B&B, pretty late. The trailer was off to the right of the main highway and was situated at the foot of a large rolling hill. There was no streetlight. The first order of business was that my roommate called her friend to let her know that they had arrived safely. They walked up to the trailer and unlocked the door and gave themselves a tour of their accommodations. They turned on all the lights in every room as they toured. My roommate had driven the entirety of the journey home, so she was a bit more fatigued than her partner. She asks him to go get the luggage from the car. It was a hatchback. The car was parked about 40 feet away. She explained to me that it had rained some weeks before, and the dirt road leading up to the house was wrapped. To avoid bottoming out, she parked on level ground. She walks into the guest bedroom, and her boyfriend's already laid out on the bed. She pleads with him to go get the luggage, and most importantly, her makeup bag, so she can remove her makeup before bed. She compromises with him that she'll go out with him if he does the heavy lifting. She doesn't want to put her heels back on, so she decides to watch him from the porch. Yes, heels. She worked at a bank and had to always dress professionally in a pant, suit, and heels. So she's standing on the top stair of the small, 3-stair porch with the front door slightly ajar. Her hand is on the knob. Her boyfriend walks off into the pitch black. The light from his phone serves as the only beacon of light signaling his location. As she watches his light grow dimmer and smaller, in the distance, she hears what she assumes to be a pack of dogs howling and barking. She said it sounded like a rumble, a pack of feral reservation dogs or coyotes fighting. The pack of dogs comes barreling down the large hill behind the trailer. She hears a loud thud against the back wall of the trailer. The thud was so loud she heard the rattling of the picture frames that were hanging inside. At this point, fear begins to creep into her mind. She calls out for her boyfriend and hears no response. She shouts for him once again. And that's when she realizes that all the dogs have gone silent. All at once, in a fluid succession of motions, she said that something from inside the trailer slams the front door so fast it creates a gust of wind. She said that if she hadn't been holding on to the doorknob, it would have knocked her off the landing, off the front steps. The front porch light flickers and goes dead. She's standing there barefoot in the darkness. She tries to open the door and retreat back into the trailer, but she was able to turn the knob until it clicked and the door was locked. Something heavy was pressed up against the flimsy manufactured hollow corridor from the inside. At this point, she said she didn't realize that she was crying and at the brink of an anxiety attack. Adrenaline took over, and she began throwing herself and all of her weight against the door. She said once she saw it inch open, and the light from inside flooded the doorway for a split second before it slammed shut in retaliation. Fight or flight, she decides to run barefoot into the darkness and find her boyfriend. This is his account. He leaves his girlfriend at the top of the front doorstep as he walks off into the dark with only his phone serving as a flashlight. He's being very careful where he steps because the earth is turned up and twisted and gnarled, deep ruts and grooves from a vehicle driving in the mud before it hardens into crust. He's afraid he might twist his ankle. He too hears the frenzied howls and barks of the dog. He turns around to look at where the sounds are coming from. In the distance, he sees the faint light of the porch light go off. He rationalizes to himself that the dog's barking might have frightened his girlfriend in fear, and she ran inside and had unintentionally turned off the porch light. He continues walking in the direction of the car. He hears the thud of heavy footsteps behind him, mimicking his own stride. Not exactly in tune with his, following just a split second after his own thud almost echoing his. Figuring it might be his frightened girlfriend running out, to find him he calls out to her to no avail. He seems a dim flicker in the distance, the light from his phone bouncing off the reflectors of the tail lights of his car. His body floods with relief. That relief quickly drains to despair. His phone erratically dies. His heart beats is almost out of his chest. How could this be? He wasn't on his phone the entire drive back. It was fully charged. He takes a few urgent paces towards where the car was before the lights turned off. His palms are sweaty, and he swears he could feel his heartbeat pounding in his hands. When he touches his chest to calm himself, he desperately reaches into his pocket for the car keys. He begins frantically pressing all the buttons, the lock, the unlock, the panic, the open the hatchback. Nothing. He even stretches out his hand in the dark as he presses the buttons, thinking he's on the cusp of the electronic radius of the vehicle to respond. Still nothing. The footsteps behind him hastened and almost sounded like he was going to be charged from the back. He's too terrified to look back, and at this point he realizes the dread he feels in the pit of his stomach means something is unnatural. His shoulders drop as if he instinctually braced for some sort of impact. The sound of the heavy footsteps would indicate that he should have been hit by now. Nothing. The footsteps loudly lead directly up to him, to his heels, and then nothing. He opens his eyes and he hears something, like a coin drop and hit the top of his car. He turns around to the powder of bare feet. On the dirt road, his girlfriend charges into a full embrace, hugging him and burying her face into his chest. Mind you, his feet stay planted. He doesn't take one step forward or back, and the car keys are still in his hand. His thumb presses down. A loud click, the familiar sound of the hatchback automatically opening, and the light from inside of the car quickly floods their immediate surroundings. They grab their luggage and a pair of flip-flops from the car and slowly make their way back to the trailer. Oddly, the front porch light is now on. My roommate makes her boyfriend go in and check all the rooms before she goes back in. He opens the door with ease. He checks each room meticulously. There's no one inside. All the windows are still locked from the inside as well. I've never retold this account to anyone, but I thought I would finally share it before time and life erases all the details from my memory. Once in the safety of the trailer, her boyfriend pulled out his cell phone and turned it on to the same battery percentage. They corroborate their experiences to recount what happened to each other. Both of them are dumbfounded at the fact that they both were shouting at the top of their lungs for each other at one time or another, but neither of them said they could hear the other. Growing up on the reservation, you hear your fair share of skinwalker and ghost stories, but this was the first time I heard one where the perpetrator manipulated electronics to a great extent or even at all. It was also the first case where the perpetrator manipulated sound waves. Both of them swore that they were easily within earshot of each other, but weren't allowed to hear the other's cries. There were no structures or trees between them, obstructing the sound waves. He had heard the pack of dogs, but wasn't allowed to hear her screaming out for him. What also spurred me to share this was the massive amount of questioning from some people. If they exist, why haven't they been filmed or caught on camera? Skinwalkers are just as modern as you and me. Wicked as much as they may be, they are not. Stupid, and they deal with smartphones and technologic advances as much as anyone. They walk the world as normal people during the day. After all, my friend Matthew, who this happened to, had just gotten home one night from hanging out with me and some other friends. Before he went inside his house, he wanted to unload some things that had been in the bed of his truck for a while. It was around 10 p.m., and his mom and brother were already asleep inside. After everything had been unloaded from the bed, he went to shut the tailgate. And as he did so, he realized that the forest around his house had gone completely silent. Normally that hour, there would be crickets chirping loudly. When he realized this, he paused for a moment and looked around. He did this for a few seconds, and seeing nothing, was about to turn and walk inside. Then, from the end of his driveway, there came an ear-piercing screech, which he said sounded like a cross between a human and an animal. He said it was easily the most terrifying thing he's ever heard or experienced. He said his heart pretty much skipped a beat when he heard the scream, and he ran around his truck, through the garage, and into the house, faster than he knew he could run. I'm very confident that he's telling me the truth, as I have known him since elementary school, and I've never known him to be someone who fabricates stories or lies about anything. I would also like to add that he hunts a lot and is familiar with the sounds made by foxes and coyotes that are said to sound like humans, and he said that this scream was definitely not like those. The other night, my mom and I were camping in Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We are regulars down there and spend countless hours on the trails and campsites. We decided to try and find a new spot. We ended up all the way down Indian Creek on 9A, almost at the end of the road. We found a beautiful campsite and were so excited to spend the night there. The first strange thing to happen was that I could not start a fire. I can't tell you how many times. I've made a fire before. I've never struggled like this time. I went through 8 campfire matches. They're much larger, and they hold a fire for 20 minutes. I went through almost an entire box of regular matches. We had a fire starter block just to make things easier and dry wood. It took me hours to get it going. I blamed the moisture in the air that night, but things continued to get weird. Next at 2:18 a.m., my mom wakes up and tells me that there's someone outside of our tent and that they've been there for about 5 minutes. I wake and see lights shining down into our tent. You can hear a woman's voice, but we're both paralyzed with fear, so we don't look out. We were down a steep hill, and the lights were coming from up on the street, only about 300 feet away. The lights did not go away for another 5 minutes. Finally, the lights and the voices were gone, but we never heard a car leave. We were on a gravel road in the middle of the night, and the nearest campsite is probably 10 walking minutes away. We would have heard a car. Finally, we fall back asleep after being spooked. At 4:19, we wake up again to my mom's phone playing music. It sounded like a sad funeral song, but it also sounded like it could have been a ringtone on her phone. Neither of us have ever heard this song before, and neither of us have alarms set. We do not have service, so her phone is on airplane mode. When she picks up the phone, the music just quits playing. She doesn't press any buttons. Her screen is still black. The song just turns off. She didn't receive any notifications from any apps. It's a blank screen, and her music app isn't playing. The next morning, I go through her phone and listen to all the different songs, and that song is nowhere on her phone. So why did this random song start and end playing on her phone in the middle of the night? Plus, when I woke her up, she was telling me about her crazy dream of someone coming up to our tent and asking to come inside. She said this dream happened twice. In the first dream, a woman comes up and asks to come inside. My mom then tries to grab something for self-defense, and the tent is so large she can't get to it. In the next dream, a man asks to come into our tent just for a minute. He says he will leave soon, but when she grabs something for self-defense, it crumbles in her hand. The guy runs away. After he sees people chasing after him, she then wakes up to the weird funeral song playing on her phone. My mom didn't know if those dreams were real or not when she woke up, and she never remembers her dreams. That night was just full of weird occurrences. If they happened by themselves, I wouldn't think anything of it. But there was so much going on in a 12-hour span, it truly felt like we were not wanted there. And I have never felt that at the gorge before.